I'm Ryan Claringbull, the director of the library. Welcome and thank you so much for attending this workshop. And this is to go, well, kind of your own personal curiosity or interest, but also towards our library initiative called One Community, Many Voices. I want to give a brief overview of that initiative, what we have planned, and then, very brief, and then take it over to Troy here to get more in the nitty-gritty of oral history. The One Community, Many Voices initiative is the library is essentially a platform to collect and share stories of Mononans and those in the Monona community. So it's not, I've been asked often, do you have to live here? No, you could go to school here, you could work here, you maybe visited often, you have family that lives here, whatever it is. And we're going to have volunteers and then also staff either go places such as like the Senior Center or Aldo Leopold Nature Center or other places, or have them come here, and we're going to have set questions that we're going to ask people. We're going to be recording them, and then we're going to edit those recordings and then make them available on our website. Along with that, some of those recordings will be edited and played over the WVMO radio station. And then another component of it is, she's not here tonight, but we're working with a local artist that we're going to be doing some paper making programs in the library using discarded books. So you pulp the books, create paper. She's going to bind the pages into journals, and then those journals are going to be here where we will allow people to write stories and then put them in the journals and make them available for people to read. So it's really a way to capture the voice of Monona. We, in terms of like target audience, it's everyone. It's all ages. We will try to get children to share their stories, families, seniors, veterans, business owners, former business owners, city staff, really everyone. And this kicked off with the Story Jam event that Tony mentioned earlier, and then we're going to be moving forward. While Tony and I are going to be really kind of focusing on this, through the funding given to us by the Friends of Monona Library, the Dane Art, and the Wisconsin Humanities Council, we will be using those funds to purchase equipment, but also to help fund a coordinator position that will help us oversee and coordinate, like scheduling the volunteers and making sure all the editing is done and everything is moving forward. So we are very excited by this initiative. And we hope that you all will help us on this, and whether it's just to record your story or help us get the stories or editing and so forth. You have those slips of paper in front of you, which I don't know if, Tony, if you were going to talk about that now, what that's for.
Okay, I think my voice is loud enough. Oh, okay. There's nothing that makes you feel like you have more power beside a clipboard than creating a little slip that people fill out. So let me tell you about my little slip, or your little slip. This really is about how you'd like to be involved in the initiative, and you can be involved in as much or as diverse number of ways that you'd like. So if everyone could fill this out by the end of the presentation, and we'll just have it in this big basket over here. And so we'd like to reach you. We'd like to start a listserv for this afterwards, so you know kind of like what the next step is going to be. So if you could put your name, email, phone, city. We'd love to know how you heard about the program. We know some of you got a personal email because other people recommended you as budding historians. But that's something we're quite interested in. And then the next question is, what is your interest and or experience in oral history collection? And if you have none, that is fine. That's kind of where most history majors start out, with 0, myself included. And then on the back, it has a number of different options in being interested in one community. One would be interviewing, so we're going to be talking about that a lot tonight. How do you take an interview and with someone? Editing, which really has to do, there'll be some video editing options, but mostly with some of the transcripts we'll be taking from people. Transcribing, and that again would be a lot of the written narratives that people are giving. So when we talk about stories, we're never talking about fiction stories. It's always a real experience in some ways. Spreading the word, So we're thinking about maybe having booths up at the Farmers Market or the Fall Festival, just to get more members of the community that might not hear about it. The goal is to get as many people in Monona as we can. And we think we're small enough that that might be an achievable goal to get a good sample. I think interviewing, being interviewed, Story Jam, and I'll send everyone out here a link to the Story Jam that we did in December, because it's kind of a moth-like StoryCorps experience. It was a lot of fun. And assisting with some of the other events, like making paper that we were talking about. The artists would love to have some helpers or some other events we might be doing. And then we have others, so that's up to you, and then any other comments you would like to make. So thank you. But we were hoping that everyone will fill one out, and before you leave, just put them in there, and the winner might get a brand new library pen. I don't know, I'm working on that one. So anyway, I'd like to introduce Troy. So if you start looking into oral histories and Wisconsin, or even just oral histories, Troy Reeves is a name that will come up immediately. Troy has quite an experience and background in collecting oral histories, and he's going to tell us about it. And I'm very curious how he got involved and how he became such an expert in the field. So I'd like everyone to give a big round of applause for Troy Reeves from UW.
I get this now, I think. Thanks. I always appreciate applause in advance. It's like, paying for your food in advance. But you actually did get some food in advance. So I want to give you an overview, let you know where we're going. I don't really call this a workshop. I call this Oral History 101, as you can see. So thanks to the Monona Public Library for hosting. Thanks to the Wisconsin Humanities Council and Dane Arts for helping to fund the stuff that the Monona Public Library is doing. I'm on the board of the Wisconsin Humanities Council, so it feels like I'm thanking myself here too, which is always fun. So thanks to me for helping you all get funded. I'm going to introduce myself here in a second. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what is and what isn't oral history, and then we'll get into the what do you need to know to do it, and then we'll probably skip the tangent depending on how I feel, and then we'll play a clip at the end and talk about the power of oral history. Okay, it's tough to see from you all that far away. Let's go full slide, although I have trouble sometimes getting back after going full slide. That's Arco, Idaho. That is all of Arco, Idaho. It fits on a picture that size. A little less than 1,000 people. That is where my grandmothers lived in the early 90s. I was going to Idaho State University. I was majoring in history. I was an early major. I was still a freshman. I was taking a class taught by Ron Hatzenbuehler that was the second half of U.S. history. So at Idaho State University, they cleaved U.S. history right at the Civil War. So it was beginnings to the Civil War to the present. So this was the Civil War to the present class. Ron Hatzenbuehler, big lecture hall, passing out a piece of paper. This was back in the 90s when you could still do things on ditto machines, so that the paper was the type was purple, which is always kind of cool. So I get this piece of paper with purple type on it, and the top of it in bold says, "You do not have to take the next test." And I thought, cool, because I didn't really want to have to take the next test. Comma, if you find someone who's lived through the Great Depression, interview them and write a paper about it. So not just get out of jail free. There was something to be done if you didn't want to take this test. I was 19 years old. Outside of oral history, I am as introverted as they come. So I didn't have oral history at that time, so I was as introverted as they come. But I wanted to try to press myself a little bit. I figured at 19 years old, that's what college was about, was to try to push your boundaries. So I am going to interview somebody who's lived through the Great Depression. And since I'm an overachiever, I was going to interview two somebodies who had lived through the Great Depression, because both of my grandmothers had lived through the Great Depression. They lived in Arco, Idaho. So I drove from Pocatello to Arco, interviewed my grandmothers, got in the car to drive back to Pocatello, Idaho, and it dawned on me. Truly, I had an epiphany, maybe the only epiphany I've ever had in my life, that the act of interviewing them, listening, because I think I listened a little bit. We'll talk about listening later. And then eventually, you know, I was going to write this down, but on the drive back, just the idea of that, listening to them humanized my grandmothers to me. Before that, they were little more than cookie receptacle devices, which is now a direct quote in the Madison Magazine, because I'm appearing in this month's Madison Magazine, so it's actually, I'm quoting myself. So at that point forward, I knew I still wanted to be a historian, but I wanted my history to be not only looking at the visual record or the written record, but the oral or the oral record. So I did a senior thesis at Idaho State University where I did oral history. At Utah State to get my master's degree in history. I did oral history, also took a folklore fieldwork class to learn a little bit more about interviewing techniques. I then volunteered at the Idaho State Historical Society after getting my degree and eventually was hired as the state oral historian, one of only 5 state oral historians there will ever be in the state of Idaho because the Idaho Oral History Center has been disbanded. I kid you not, my state job title was historian, oral. The only one in the state that had that job title. I did that for 7 years. I got out of oral history for a little bit at the State Historical Society. Found a job opening here at UW-Madison to head their oral history program. Applied, got the job in June of 2007 and have been here ever since. I'm going to exit out of the slideshow because I do want to show you our website. I do also want to say that I will work with Ryan and Tony to send a follow-up email to you all. So if you all checked in and we have your email, I will have some forms and such that, and some other things that I may talk about, links to websites. This is the front page of our oral history program. You'll see it's part of the UW Archives and Records Management. That's because the oral history program is part of the University Archives on campus. That is in Steenbach Library. Let's see if we go back to the PowerPoint, if I have a picture of the beautiful Steenbach Library. Nope, no picture of Steenbach Library today. Steenbach Library is always voted as the second least aesthetically pleasing building on campus. We all know what is the first least aesthetically pleasing building on campus. Humanities. The only building that's ever built upside down, which is a myth. It wasn't built upside down, but it certainly looks that way. So I want to talk a little bit now about what is oral history, so we know how to define our term before we start to talk about how to do good ones. So the Oral History Association, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in the next slide, they've been meeting for 52 years now. This is the national organization that oversees oral history activity in this country. They've been meeting since 1966. That first meeting in 1966 was in a hotel convention center in Southern California near Lake Arrowhead, so somewhere between Los Angeles and San Diego. About 40, close to 50 people attended that first meeting. There were people who were either conducting interviews, archives that had interviews. There were people who were ready, willing, and able to come together and talk about what oral history is. So after one of the days of the conference, one of the oral historians decided, after a long day of talking about oral history, that he needed to go to the bar. I mentioned earlier that I worked in the state of Idaho. I gave the presentation like this in Idaho a lot of times among members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the Mormons, although they don't want you to call them Mormons anymore. I figure I'm grandfathered in, so I can keep calling them Mormons. At this point in Idaho, I'd have to explain what a bar is, what a drink is, why sometimes people need to have one after a long day of work. I've been here in Wisconsin for 11 and a half years. I've never had to stop and explain the importance of a bar or an after-work drink. So a gentleman was sitting at the bar, purposely segregated himself from the rest of the oral history crew, sat down next to somebody he had no idea, never met before, but as people are wont to do as they're sitting side by side at a bar, they started to chat. Eventually the gentleman looked at the oral historian and said, "Well, what do you do for a living?" And the oral historian said, "Well, I'm an oral historian." The other gentleman smiles. The oral historian's quickly thinking, "Wow, this guy must get it. I'm not going to have to explain myself. This is great." Smile leaves the gentleman's face. He opens his mouth and he says, "Geez, I'm so glad you're doing that, because the history of dentistry is sadly neglected here on the West Coast." So if I had a whiteboard, which I don't, but if I had a whiteboard, I would write the mathematical equation: oral history, equal sign with a slash through it, which means does not equal dentistry. If you want to interview dentists, that's fine. Go right ahead. But that's not what oral history is. That comes from, as a good historian, I try to cite my source. That actually comes from Charlie Morrissey, as you can see down there in an article he wrote in 1980 called Why Oral History, and that is a beautiful picture of the UW-Madison Terrace. I add pictures of our archival collection because we have a rich photography or image collection. We have 2.5 million photos in our collection, and only about 20,000 of them are scanned, which means we have 2 million photos in our collection that you can only see by coming to the archive. So I try to highlight them during my presentation to show you some of our rich image collection at the University Archive. So what is oral history? So as I said, the Oral History Association, very easy URL, oralhistory.org. You can read it, but I will read it to you as well. The Oral History Association promotes oral history as a method of gathering and preserving historical information through recorded interviews with participants in past events and ways of life. So I said that I interviewed my grandmothers. I didn't conduct oral history with them because I wasn't smart enough to record it. Oral history requires that you record. Use some type of device. I noticed in the back there was their Zoom H2N. At some point I probably will pop out our digital recorder out of this box right here to show you. But you're also gathering and preserving. So you're asking questions, but you're also preserving the audio or audio video to those questions as well as those answers. Historical information. History happens anywhere, anytime. Meaning history could be 2 generations ago, history could be a generation ago, history could be yesterday. I believe we inaugurated a governor yesterday. Pretty historical. With past events and ways of life. I want to add a little bit to this. This comes from the book Doing Oral History. It is in its 3rd edition. That's the cover of the 3rd edition. I'm going to quote from the 2nd edition. As you can see here, oral history generally consists of a well-prepared interviewer, questioning an interviewee, which in oral history parlance we call a narrator. So I'm going to be saying narrator a lot. That can be interchangeable with the term interviewee. And recording their exchange on audio or videotape. You can see the 2nd edition is in 2003 because tape was so 2003. Like we don't hardly record on tape anymore. We'll talk about what we record on as we get in a little bit deeper into the evening. So it's the idea of being well prepared. I mean, you can find somebody, you can find a recorder, you can turn that recorder on and you can ask that somebody, okay, tell me about your life. But I mean, think about that if somebody asked you that. Where would you start? What would be going through your mind? How would you be able to sort of figure out what you want to say? So we try to be well prepared and well trained, and that's what we're going to do for the next little bit, is I'm going to give you some tips, I hope, and some tricks about how to be well prepared and well trained, except for I have one other soapbox I need to get on. What's not oral history? The web is deep. The web is deep. The internet is deep, isn't it? Feels like an ocean. Within that ocean, there are people putting the word oral history into web pages to try to, get people to click on their site to listen. These sites probably do have interviews. This is an interview of One Direction. This crowd, no offense to this crowd is probably a little, well, there's at least maybe one person in the back, yep, hands up. Who knows who One Direction is? The rest of us, I only know One Direction because I have teenage kids. But what this will do, I didn't put the person's name, so they will conduct interviews. They will interview One Direction and people around them. They will write an article about it. It's basically a newspaper article that you would see in the newspaper back in the day. They call it oral history. Almost all of them have no desire or interest in actually trying to archive these so you could actually listen to the interviews. You might be interested in more than what is just put on this web page, because all the web page is the juicy bits, the great excerpts. You won't get that. So they may have gathered. They may be providing access in a way, but not providing full access. But I certainly don't think that they're actually preserving this in any way. I mean, they may think this web page is going to live forever because the web's going to live forever. It's not oral history. So let me give you 3 examples just to tell you a little bit about when you see the word oral history on a website, what you should look for. These are 3 great examples. I can say that because I had nothing to do with the making of any of them. The Wisconsin Historical Society has a great web page with Wisconsin survivors of the Holocaust. These were interviews that were done in the 70s and 80s on analog cassette tape. And then about 12 years ago, about the same time I got here, they got outside funding to digitize those cassettes, to scan the transcripts that were created, and to create transcripts for interviews that hadn't yet been transcribed, and put them on their website. So they gathered, they preserved, and they provided access. So you can go to that website and you can listen to or read interviews with people who were in Europe in the 30s and 40s, and then who were in Wisconsin in the 70s and 80s, talking about their life in Europe and also talking about their life in America. The middle one, Italians in Milwaukee Oral History Project, from my friends at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Libraries. Again, digital collection. You can go there, you can see that they have gathered oral history. You can see that they preserved that oral history, and you can get access to that oral history. The third is from my friends at the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh, Black Thursday. So 10 years ago, really 11 years ago, a couple of professors at UW Oshkosh went to track down as many of 82 African Americans who went to UW Oshkosh in 1968 to interview them about their life. The reason why they did that was in November 12th, 1968, a few of those 82 African Americans staged a sit-in at the president of the then Wisconsin State University at Oshkosh's office with a list of demands. They never received an audience with the president. So as they were leaving, frustratedly as they were leaving, admittedly as they were leaving, they did some minor vandalism. Some plants got knocked over, some file cabinets got opened up, and they left. A few students left. A few of the 82 were a part of this. The next day, all 82 African American students at Oshkosh were expelled. Not only that, they could not matriculate at any other UW school. 2 of them tried to matriculate at UW-Madison the next semester. They were found out and they were not allowed to matriculate at UW-Madison. So my colleagues tracked down as many of the 82 as they could, conducted oral history. On the 40th anniversary, they had an exhibit at UW Oshkosh. They had an opening reception at UW Oshkosh. And they just had a reception 2 months ago now to honor the 50th anniversary of what they call Black Thursday. This website does not have full access to the oral histories, but you can get full access to the oral histories at UW Oshkosh, and you can find out about that from that website. So gathered, preserved, provided access, oral history. I will get off my soapbox now. All right, so yes, Troy, that's all great, but what do I need to know? So to do good oral history, whether it be oral history interviews, an individual interview, or a project, a series of interviews on a topic, you should do these 4 things. There are some of you in the audience who might get this. This slide is brought to you by the number 4 and the letter C. Right, several of you actually watched Sesame Street growing up, bless your hearts. So collecting, we collect oral history, we curate or preserve, we communicate or celebrate the fact that we've done these projects or done these interviews, and for the most part, we almost have to collaborate. My friend Chuck Lee, who was head of the oral history program at UW La Crosse, would say in the humanities, we do not have a poverty of ideas. We just have a poverty of everything else. We don't do what we do without help from others. It's just a fact of life in the humanities, which is part of the reason why the Wisconsin Humanities Council exists, part of the reason why places like Dane Arts exist, to be able to help fund projects to do oral history and other similar things. That's Crazy Legs Hirsch. I put that up mainly for the students that I guest lecture to every semester to let them know that Crazy Legs was an actual person and not just a race that they run in April, probably whilst hungover. We have an interview with Crazy Legs in our collection, Oral History 440, I believe. And then that, of course, is a picture of Crazy Legs from our image collection. All right, so here we are. I call these best practices. You can see down the bottom in red, the Oral History Association. It's not called the Best Practices Guide. We just updated it. It was just approved by the organization in October. But that is indeed the URL, and I will remember to send you in the follow-up email the URL to what we are calling our Oral History Association Principles and Best Practices. It's a suite of documents that if you go to after this, you will see that we have documents on best practices, we have documents on ethics, and by documents I mean these are actually short, what we hope to be fairly accessible documents. We have a document telling about who we are as an organization, what we believe in, which we call our core document. We have a document about what it means to be a narrator for an oral history interview and what your rights may be as a narrator to an oral history interview. Those are the 4 key documents. We have an introduction and we have a glossary of terms too, because as with most organizations, we sometimes speak in code. And so that glossary, we hope, decodes some of our information for people. So I'm not going to talk anything specifically about those documents, but what I'm going to talk about is imbued by the fact that I've been doing oral history for 20 years. I've been a part of this organization for 20 years. And I've been a part of the revision of the best practices and general principles, which we called it 11 years ago, and the new document for 12 years. So I strongly believe in what I do, and I strongly believe that we have principles for what we do. And I'm going to talk about that as we talk about collecting, curating, and communicating. So you need to choose a topic. Duh. That topic could be an individual. The 2 types of oral history interviews are biographical. So you interview Grandpa about Grandpa's life. You might start at the beginning and end at the end. The other is episodical or topical. So for example, we have a couple of interview projects going that some students are doing. One is book artists. So UW-Madison has a rich art department, and it has a rich history in teaching people how to make books, not only mass market books, but books that then you create your own art within. So artists' books. We received funding and were able to interview, I think we've interviewed, we will have interviewed 20 book artists and or faculty or staff who have helped train these book artists. What's going to happen in 2020, I'll talk about this, reiterate it when I get to the communicating or celebrating, is the Chazen Museum will have an exhibit that will show not only these book artists' books, but will also have excerpts from the oral histories. It'll be a part of the Chazen Museum's 50th anniversary. We're quite proud and excited to be a part of that. So that's one topical or episodic oral history. So we're looking at their life, but looking at their life only through the lens of being a book artist. Another recent, we stopped doing interviews on this a couple years ago, the Capitol protests of 2011. Do we all remember February and March of 2011, those of us who were here? So we've interviewed a couple dozen, primarily graduate students who were involved in those protests. So again, very specific. In this case, it's about a very specific time period, 6 weeks or so. But since we're historians, we also try to get a little bit of context there of their life before and after. Once you have a topic, you need to do research. Oral history, the second term is history. Oral historian, the second term is historian. To be a historian is to do research. So research on the person, research on the topic. This will get away from you having to ask very general questions. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about questions specifically. Also will get you to be as, expert is a really loaded term, I think. It will get you to be as knowledgeable about the person or topic as possible. And I think that's never a bad thing when you're going to be interviewing somebody, to know as much about them or about the topic as possible. Create a topic or a question list. I don't get asked as much this in Madison, but in Idaho I got asked this a lot. I would get a call and it would go something like this. I'm interviewing a minor, not a minor under the age of 18, but a minor as in somebody who actually tries to get ore out of the earth. Can you give me your question list on to interview a minor? No, because I don't know what was the person mining, when, where, how long. General questions beget general answers, and you can get general answers anywhere. You're doing this because you have a chance to ask somebody questions about their life, specific questions about their life. So by doing your research, you should be creating a question or topic list to get at those specific questions, specific topics. Now, there are questions that help spark memory, and those are great, and those are somewhat broad questions, and you can pepper those in. But really what you should be doing is you should be trying to get at specific questions so you can help hopefully spark the person's memory for them to talk about their life or their part in the, either their whole life or their part in the topic that you're interested in. Get training, which is what you're doing here. Find a recorder and find people to interview. Again, narrators is a term that we use. We'll talk a little bit more about recorders. I have a follow-up slide. I strongly recommend once you have a list of people to interview, if possible, and I understand that sometimes this isn't possible, but meet them in advance. Don't bring the recorder. Meet them in advance. Let them ask questions of you. Why are you doing this? Where is it going to end up? You know, I just interviewed somebody today who was involved in an observatory that was shot into space in December of 1968, and part of its payload was created by scientists here at UW-Madison. And the first thing he said to me, he said, before you turn that on, I want to know what you're doing with this. It also gives me a chance to show them, none of you will be able to see this, but I will include this as one of the forms, our release form. And we'll talk a little bit more about release forms shortly. It also, if I have it done, gives me a chance to give them either the full-blown question list or the topic list. I do not want to surprise them with questions. I probably will anyway, because there'll be some follow-up questions, but I want them to know where I'm coming from. And so that meeting with the narrator is also a chance for me to give them the list. My hope is they actually look at it and they say, that's great. And not because I need it for my ego, but hopefully because I've done my work. But they may also say, well, that also reminds me, though, there's these other things I'd like to talk about. So that meeting is helping me build a better topic list. Explain the project. There are certain projects that we do at UW-Madison where we also have to get their written consent. So this is a release form I just showed you, but we also sometimes have a consent form that's saying that they signed it, that they consent to be interviewed, which is another reason why sometimes it's good for us to have a pre-interview. So they know where we're coming from. Hopefully we get their consent and we can conduct an interview with them. I've been talking at you ad nauseum. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand. I will do my best to answer it. And look at that. See, should I have said that earlier? Go ahead.
I held on to it. I may have missed this in the beginning, but these slides that you're showing to us, is this available for us? Are these slides available to us?
Well, I think this is being recorded, so you'll be able to have access. I think, will everybody that's a part of this project, I'm looking at Tony and she's nodding her head. So anybody will have access to this. Yes, yes. Tony nods head, as we'll put in the transcript. So you'll have audio access to it to be able to review it. I change these slides almost every time I do a presentation. I mean, I certainly can give you access to them if you want. Hopefully, maybe it'll be a way to spark your memory about what I talked about. Part of the reason, though, why I do a follow-up email is for that, too, but I'll make a note. Anybody else? Yes, Rick.
What's the difference between a consent form and a
Sure.
release form?
Yeah. So consent basically says, so Rick, if I'm interviewing you, want to interview you, and if I need you to have sign a consent form, that just says that you're ready to be interviewed. You have now consented to be interviewed. Once I interview you, then I'm also going to have you sign a release form. And I'll get to it a little bit more, but just to quickly say, the release form then allows us at the archives, or you at the Historical Society, if you were doing the interview with me, to be able to house that interview and be able to have people access that interview. Sometimes people jam them together, but on campus they're very, very persnickety and want us to make sure that we have a consent form and a release form separately. I would say for a project like this, you probably don't need one. You should have a release form. But it's always a good idea to make sure that they understand as a narrator what they're getting into. So it's never a bad idea to have a consent form. Okay. So you want to find a location to conduct an interview. You want it to be as free from noise as possible. So this is the audience participation part. So any introverts in the audience may just feel free not to try to answer this. This is an homage to where I grew up, and I'm guessing maybe where some of you grew up too. AM radio at noon in Blackfoot, Idaho would broadcast a noise. And then you'd have the course of the hour to call in and try to guess what that noise was. And if you won, you got like a $5 gift certificate to the Bronco Hut. Blackfoot's high school's mascot was the Broncos. I was the Snake River Panther. I lived on the outside of town, but I still got to guess that noise. This is an actual honest-to-God oral history interview that I'm going to play an excerpt from. I'm going to play a few seconds, and I'm going to ask those of you who want to play to raise your hand and guess what noise or noises make this interview sound the way it sounds.
During very tenuous positions, and they tend to fall down, and you watch out for that kind of thing. You certainly watch out for rock all the time, and be careful.
Okay, welcome to Guess That Noise. I'm your host, Troy Reeves. Oh, yes.
I'm thinking an engine.
An engine, okay. We're gonna get a bunch of guesses here.
A laundromat, a dryer.
Dryer, okay. Okay, washer, dryer, yes. Fan. Yes.
If it were Madison, I would think a street cleaner.
Yes. Street cleaner. Anybody else want to play? All good guesses so far. Yes, Tony.
Car wash.
Car wash.
At first I thought it sounded like street noise, and then I wondered if it was just a bad recorder.
All right. Yes, see now.
How about rain?
How about rain? Excellent. Excellent guesses. All right. So if we were playing Family Feud, we all know Family Feud. Did you all watch it in the era of Richard Dawson? Because he was actually the best at Family Feud, because he was half in the bag at least 2/3 of the time.
Did they know that in Idaho, though?
I did. I'm not sure my Mormon friends did. Number one answer would be air conditioner or fan. Only one time I've played this that somebody didn't guess air conditioner or fan. Washer dryer is number two answer. And then we have these answers that rain comes up occasionally. Engine, I think that might be the first time that I've heard engines say that way. Street cleaner, I've had carpet cleaner once, which I did this interview. I took a bit of offense to, that I would actually let a carpet cleaner continue to run while I was conducting an oral history interview. So the deal is, I conducted this interview in the year 2000 with a digital audio tape player. Nobody here knows what a digital audio tape player, because it was on the market for about 15 minutes, and I bought the thing the 15 minutes it was on the market. So I have this digital audio tape player, I have this digital microphone. So somebody said bad recorder, this comes in a little bit. This digital microphone, it's in a black bag like that. I go outside, I'm gonna walk the 10 or 12 blocks to my friend Gene McVeigh's house in Boise. He was a former forest firefighter, and I was interviewing former smoke jumpers and forest firefighters. So it was a chance for me to break in my digital audio tape player, interview somebody that if it didn't work well, we could redo it and I wouldn't lose any rapport, because Gene and I knew each other. It was 105 degrees that day in Boise. So I'm walking to Gene McVeigh's house with a black bag, with a black microphone, with a black recorder, hoping the thing doesn't melt. I get to Gene's house. Gene's house is being remodeled, which is the absolute worst place to conduct an oral history interview. For those of you who don't know, I'll tell you. Because there are two types of rooms in a remodeled house. Those that are being remodeled, that have nothing but power tools in them, and those that aren't being remodeled, which has all the furniture from the rooms that are being remodeled Jenga'd into them. So they had created a path from the front door to the kitchen. So I followed Gene in that path, and we go outside to conduct the interview outside, where Gene does two things. Before we go outside, he offers me a beer. I no longer work for the state of Idaho, so I can say, yeah, I took that beer. It was 105 degrees outside. The second thing he did, as we went outside, he turned on the misters on his patio trellis. Misters? So he had the trellis and he had some hanging plants, so he had sort of tubing with some, so misters. So I had a digital audio tape player, and the only way I could actually process the audio was to create an analog cassette copy of it, because I couldn't play the digital audio tape any other way. Has anybody ever made a cassette recording, like a mixtape? You know, pining for someone that you care about, mixtape? No? Okay. When you make an analog cassette copy, there's always that little misters plus hiss equals that. So thank you all for playing. What does that mean? That means you find a location that minimizes the noise. You don't freak out about it. Like, this is where I'll have students come back to me and they'll say, well, I found a room, it was pretty good, and at one point though, this plane went overhead, and I'm not sure what it did for the audio. Well, it's like, you're fine. It was a plane, it happens. What you want to try to do is, within that environment, control the sound as much as possible. So, turn off the fan, turn off the TV, turn off the radio. My colleague in Baylor claims that this isn't him. It's one of these things where he says it's a colleague of his, one of those stories. Says that he will also unplug the refrigerator if he's recording at somebody's kitchen table. And he's learned to put the keys in the refrigerator, because that means he has to remember to plug the refrigerator back in. Do not unplug the refrigerator. All right? The refrigerator noise is going to be fine. The white noise of the refrigerator is going to be fine. Let's not try to possibly ruin somebody's food to get a quality oral history interview. But minimize the noise the best you can. Test the recorder. You should do that at any point. You want to make sure that you know it well enough that you can be glancing at it to make sure it works, because you want to spend most of your time at the interview listening. And we're going to get to that here in that next bullet point. So, once you have a room that's fairly free of noise, understanding that sometimes there's some things you can't control, but the things you can control, you're going to need to ask questions. Again, duh. Most people won't just jump in with their stories. You are going to have to engage them in some way. And you engage them by questions. And again, you engage them by questions that are specific to them. Hopefully, these questions are open-ended. Do we all know the difference between open and closed? For those of you who may not. Closed is like a fact-based question. How old are you? How many years have you been here? How long have you worked at UW? Open-ended is sort of the hows and the whys, that describes the feels. The questions that hopefully open up a door, if you will, to allow them to talk in depth. If you've done your research and you still need to know a fact, you need to ask a closed question. I always try to, if I ask it, I try to follow it immediately up with some type of open-ended follow-up question. Because what I don't want them to think is, I don't want them to think that this is a questionnaire or a survey that they then can just answer as briefly as possible. The point of this is to allow people to speak at length. Balance the project's needs and the narrator's desires. What do I mean by that? This is also the part of the show where somebody might start asking, well, you know, what if you interview somebody and they go off on a tangent? So you may be interviewing somebody about, well, there's not many World War II veterans around anymore, not many Korean War, let's say Vietnam War. You may interview somebody about the Vietnam War, and all of a sudden they're talking about the Vietnam War, and then they're at a baseball game in San Diego in 1980, and then all of a sudden that has triggered their mind to talk about being in Washington, D.C. in 1992, and all of a sudden you are nowhere near where you think you are, question-wise. We'll talk about how to bring them back, possibly bring them back from that in a minute. The other part of this, though, is the idea of you come in there with questions you want to ask. But you are talking to a human being, and this may be the only time that somebody has taken the time to listen to what they have to say. So yes, you may come in with a list of topics. They may come in with a list of things they want to talk about too. Yes?
You may have already addressed this, maybe I zoned
That's
out.
fine.
I apologize in advance, but they can see the questions. You give them the list of the same questions that you're asking.
What I do, and this is where the art and the science comes in, I give them my overarching topics. So I want them to know sort of the key topics. There are some people who give them word for word the questions they're going to ask.
Okay.
I don't usually ask the questions word for word. I usually sort of riff off the topics, fumble it a little bit. Part of that is just the way that my mind works. The other part is I'm hoping that by hearing a question that is somewhat fumbled, that they feel like they don't have to speak in the Queen's English, that they can answer it how they speak. Because I really don't want them trying to, I want them to speak from their heart and not necessarily speak for posterity, but not try to be perfect. Mm-hmm. But I do try to make sure that they know where I'm coming from. But that doesn't mean that they still won't have some ideas about where they want to go. Did somebody have their hand up? Yes.
So when I talk to my mom and ask her questions and try and draw up memories, we have a lot of fun with storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And then as soon as I pull out the recorder, she goes into this really slow, deliberate, digging in her brain voice that's very different than her own voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't seem to get her out of that.
You're not the first daughter who has tried to get mom, on the record, and mom either doesn't want to, or mom's a little different on the record than she is off the record. Sometimes grandkids are a nice sort of conduit. Sometimes, as my friend and Joe's friend Jim Leary will tell you, sometimes you're just not going to get it the way you want to get it, or you're not going to get it all. And so you probably might also need to just be satisfied with what it is.
Do you have to have a release for your mom? Maybe you can hide the recorder?
She knows how to record things.
I'd be worried too.
One of the things, one of the things that happens sometimes is that the storytelling with everybody starts, and I'll turn the recorder on, and it's, really challenging because everybody, you know how it is with people.
Mm-hmm.
They play off of each other's memories and they interrupt each other.
Yep.
And that, but my mom, it's not that she doesn't want to be recorded.
Right.
It's that she something changes when
Mm-hmm.
she knows that the recorder is on.
Mm-hmm.
Something changes in the way that she speaks.
Right.
So it's
I
not-
guess the other thing would be, are you still getting the stories you want to get, though?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think then, that is, I see it in a more, I would live with that more than I would live with the fact that, mom tells these great 7-minute stories when she's talking to me, and I turn the recorder on and they turn into 7-second stories. Like, you've heard that one. Mm-hmm. Now, if you have a mom who says that, then you might want to remind mom that you're recording this not really for me, the daughter, but we're recording it for posterity, like for her grandkids and great-grandkids.
So when we start recording stories for the library of people that we don't really know like that,
Mm-hmm.
it might be different in the way that we are able to interact with them. So I really like that you said to try and meet them ahead of time so you can kind of get to know their personality.
Yep. and they can get to know you too. And it gives them space again to be able to ask questions of you, because the oral history really should be you asking questions of them. Unless it's an oral history where both of you have sort of shared knowledge and it becomes more of a dialogue. But for the most part, particularly probably for a project like this, they're going to be volunteer interviewers, and that's going to be their job to ask questions. I want to get at something that you mentioned there, and that's the sort of the group interview versus the one-on-one interview. While the Oral History Association doesn't rail against group interviews, we do try to express the importance or lean more towards one-on-one interviews, and here are a couple reasons why. One is that as far as archival fidelity, sometimes it's just, particularly in an audio interview, it's just easier for future generations to know that Troy's interviewing Rick, or Joe's interviewing Troy, or Tony's interviewing Troy, so that way future generations sort of know that. The other thing is that once you start to bring a group together, you bring group dynamics together. So you interview a husband and wife together. Never interview a husband and wife together. Okay, that's not true. All right. Love you, honey. But once you bring people together, particularly people in a family, you're bringing together dynamics and personalities that you then probably have very little control over. And there'd be one person who might really have the stories that you want to hear, but they're going to defer to this person because they've deferred to this person for 30 years, and they're, come hell or high water, they're going to continue to defer to this person. The other thing is, archivally, if it's video, it's a little easier, but if it's audio and there's 6 people talking and they're talking over each other, people listening to it to try to glean information from it, historical information. Linguistically, Joe, it might be great. People talking over each other. Let the record show that Joe Salmons is nodding his head no. So to get back, just to kind of roll back on this, our hope in the Oral History Association is that you take some time to balance the project's needs and the person's desires. Meaning if they want to talk about, you want to interview them about their time here, working for some company in Monona, but they want to spend a little bit of their time talking about Vietnam or Desert Storm or playing football for UW. If that's important to them, our hope in the OHA that you take some time to let them have the space to talk about that. Understanding that time is precious and time is finite, and this project's about Monona, but try to balance what they want to talk about with what you want to ask. And then in the end, on this should be for any project that's going to have some sort of public face, you need to have a release form signed. So Rick, we talked about this earlier, but basically the release form is signed both by the person asking the questions and by the person answering them, and it allows the interviews to be used usually by a third party. So in our case, it allows the interviews to be used by the UW-Madison Archives, might be Wisconsin Historical Society, might be the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures, but it's a form where both people sign it, and then people who come in and use that interview or who access that interview online know that they have the permission of the people who are speaking to be able to use that interview. Yes?
Is the release form digitized and put with the oral recording?
It is now. Back in the day, and even it's a handwritten form, but now you can scan it. So it's not really, like in terms of metadata, it's not really like embedded with the audio file, but within the package of what you see with somebody's oral history, you should see the audio, any sort of documentation helping describe that audio, and then the release form. But you should also, as a consumer, you can always ask if there's a release form, but most archives and libraries won't give you access to the interview if there isn't some sort of release form. So you as a consumer can usually be pretty safe in the fact that if you found it online or if you found it in archives, that the archives has permission to do that. Yes?
Something. Is there sort of a predetermined length that you want to shoot for and you tell them ahead of time?
I think there's a predetermined length if you talk to them in advance about how long they feel comfortable in talking or how long you want them. I say 60 minutes, but you know why I say 60 minutes? because I grew up in the analog age and the tapes were 60 minutes. So what I say now is my interview session I'd like to do with you could be as short as 45 to 50 minutes. It could be as long as 70 minutes. Partially because after about 60 minutes, my listening skills fall off a cliff. And it's important for me to try to be present and to listen. And so I know I can't go any longer than that. I also know that some of the people that I'm interviewing probably can't go any longer than that, or even not even as long as that, because of their health. Yes?
So there's the real possibility that you might not finish the interview.
There's a real possibility that when you hit stop, you still have questions you want to ask. And
Questions that weren't answered.
that
So,
too.
yeah, okay.
And I think that's actually a sign of a pretty good oral history interview, or it's a sign of an interview where somebody went off on a tangent and you never reel them back in. Yes?
So what if you have questions that come up that aren't on your list?
The follow-up question. Those are the best, I feel those are the best questions you can ask.
Okay.
And I think you should ask those. They help make an anecdote even richer. Sometimes they provide information about an event that relates, but you have no idea that it related because you may have done your research, but you didn't get to that part of your research. I would hope that you ask every follow-up question you possibly can, open-ended follow-up question, and that becomes more of your interview than even the questions on your list. Now, I say that because I have a job that allows me to go back and also do a follow-up interview with them. So I'm rarely worried about the fact if I have questions left unasked, because I can just say, would you like to meet for one more session? Up into about 6 hours. That's about as much as I can give somebody before I have to go somewhere else mentally and physically and just programmatically.
Well, I think the follow-up question indicates that you're an involved, active listener.
That is exactly right.
It rewards the
Yep.
Narrator.
Yep. And the flip side of that is if you're not engaged and involved and they do go off on a tangent and then all of a sudden they say, now where were we? And you go, I don't know, where were we? It's a rhetorical device that really only works with teachers. It doesn't really work with oral history.
No, it doesn't work.
So, yes, the follow-up should show the narrator or interviewee that you are actively engaged. And I think the more you show them you're actively engaged, the more apt they are to continue answering questions as fully as they can or as fully as they want to. Oh, I think I went 2 there. Yeah. Okay. Actually, I have these slides out of order. So I want to talk a bit more about what we bring to an oral history interview. Probably should have done this before the questions, but that was all great. Thank you so much for those questions. I'd much rather engage us as a community than me talk at you, particularly because I still seem to be trying to kick a New Year's Eve cold I got by holding my 10-month-old grandniece far more than I should have, but the girl's so cute that I had no choice. So this is what we record with at the UW-Madison Oral History Program. This is what we loan out to students and staff. This is a Zoom H2N. This is, I think you can buy just this. We have, yeah, there's one over here too. So I think you can buy just that box for, I think it might be close to 100, 120 bucks now. You have to buy all this other stuff. What I love about Zoom is that they sell you this and then they're like, well, but if you want to plug it into the wall, you have to buy the accessory kit. If you want to put it on the tripod, you have to buy the accessory kit. But it runs off batteries. I mean, you could conceivably just use this to record. It's got a nice sturdy base, and Tony has a question.
Oh, it's just a statement. No one has to buy this if you're part of the project.
Yes. We are not asking you, well, I'm not asking you to buy anything. But yes, if you're involved in the project, there will be recorders Not this one, this is mine, but there will be recorders for you to loan. So, recorder, I want to read to you how far we've come in now 80 years. So back in the 30s, as part of the one of FDR's alphabet soup projects was the WPA, which then there was also the Federal Writers Project, so the FWP within the WPA. John and Alan Lomax drove around the South collecting stories and songs. They initially did it without a recording device, but they finally were able to acquire a recording device, and this is John's recollection of the recording device. Stored in the rear of the car were 2 cots and bedding, a cooking outfit, provisions, and a change of clothing, an infinite number of et ceteras, that's in quotes, which will manage to encumber any traveler. Later, as a crown to our discomfort, we also carried a 350-pound recording machine. A cumbersome pile of wire and iron and steel built into the rear of the Ford.
Wow.
So I've mentioned the word rapport a couple of times. Rapport is one of those words where you try to build an affinity or a relationship with somebody. So you could imagine saying, oh, it's great, I'm glad you consented to be interviewed. Now can I back my Ford up to your front door so I can conduct the interview? You don't have any underground sprinklers or anything that I'd run over. 2 batteries weighing 75 pounds each. So it's either a 500-pound recording machine or 150 of the 350 pounds are batteries. A microphone, a complicated machine of delicate adjustments, coils of wire, numerous gadgets, besides scores of blank aluminum and celluloid discs, and finally a multitude of extra parts of the purpose and place for which neither Alan nor I had the faintest glimmer of an idea. 500 pounds. And that really wasn't that long ago. I'm not a weightlifter. This is not 500 pounds. This is less than a pound. Altogether, the clamshell bag that I carry around, which has an adapter if you want to do microphone-like recording, like person on the street. The tripod, as I said. I always bring a couple of extra batteries. Even though I try to use wall power, there's batteries in the recorder, backup batteries. I said we used to record on tape. Tape is so 2003. This is what we record on now. You've probably all seen these. They probably have fit either in a camera of yours at some point. The recorder I've already shown you. Of course, since I do like to have wall power, I also like to have the extension cord. Because where they want to be comfortable, probably has everything in the world plugged into it. I just watched A Christmas Story for like 65 times between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Those of you who don't know the show, everything was plugged into the one outlet that they had in the house. And that's really about it. Fits easy in this clamshell bag. So that's the clamshell bag right there. Usually I forget to bring it, but you can see here, it's smaller than an 8.5 by 11 manila folder. That's what fits in it. There are people who are now recording on these devices. I would say up until even maybe about 3 years ago, I would have stood up here and railed against recording with these. You can get a nice, the microphone is actually pretty good, but you can actually get an adapter that plugs in to make your microphone even better. My only concern about these, particularly when I'm working with students, is I want to make sure that we can get it off of this, because I've had to play a recording on a smartphone while recording it on here, because it was the only way we could figure out how to get the damn thing off the phone. So we got it. Sound quality wasn't great. But there are apps now, again, there are attachments. This also has a nice camera too. So if you're going to do an audio interview, this gives you the chance to actually document it with a camera too, instead of having to bring a camera and a recorder. All right, so yes.
Do you recommend that?
Do I recommend?
Photographs and,
Sure.
is that
So this is where my folklore friends kick my butt. They are much better. They've been trained, it's been imbued, ethnographers, folklorists, it's been imbued in them too. Not only do you get the voice if you're going to do audio, but yes, you get the image as well. And not only the image of them, but the image of what they're talking about. So, you know, if somebody's brewing their own beer, and that's what you're really interested in, because that brew your own beer turned into a small brewery that turned into New Glarus, you might want a picture of that first brewery. This would also be a time probably where an audio-video interview might even be more appropriate. I'm not a big fan of audio-video for a couple reasons. One is I'm a one-person shop. I say we a lot, and this is where my father voice pops into my head, and he would always say when I would say we, he's like, "What do you got, boy, a mouse in your pocket?" There's no we in the oral history program, there's me. And fortunately, students and others that we've been able to find funding for. So if I'm doing a video, I still would be concerned about how it's framing, and it would shift my focus. I'd be focused on that and trying to listen, and I can't do that very well. So if I'm doing video, I still want somebody to video it, so that's what they're worried about. Because what I'm worried about is if I'm interviewing an old timer, and he's sitting like this, and then all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, I got to show you this picture." Okay, so I was saying, and now all of a sudden I'm just videoing nothing. The other thing too, well, I won't talk about this because archivally, just in general, what I will say is that video files are much larger than audio files. So in terms of storage, it's much easier to store audio files than video files. But having said all that, a situation where somebody may actually be doing something, like maybe they want to show you how they brewed their first batch of home brew. That would come across much better in an audio-video interview than just an audio interview. So keep that in mind as you go, if you go beyond this project to start doing your own oral history, think about that. Most of who I interview would end up being a lot of talking heads too, and really you don't need 70 minutes of some one person's face.
Some people are intimidated by video.
Some people are still intimidated. I think that is less and less, but you're right. There are some people that as soon as the video, like if the audio recorder turns on and they freeze a little bit, think of what happens when the video camera turns on. So quickly, just to go through this then, as I said, recording device, tapes, in this case memory cards, microphone and stand. The Zoom, part of the reason why we give out the Zoom is this company has done a very good job of having an inboard, if you will, microphone. So the top of this is a microphone that'll let you record in 2-channel or even 4-channel. It actually records worse when you hook up a lapel mic and stick it to somebody than just using this, because the channel, the connection between the mic makes the sound quality a little worse. So that's why we don't have an external microphone for this, but most recorders, most digital audio recorders, it is better to have an external mic so the mic can be as close to the person being interviewed as possible. Again, we have this little tripod that the Zoom screws into the bottom of. This gets the recorder off the table and closer to the person's mouth. Batteries, extension cord, power cord, props. So if you have pictures, ephemera like newspaper articles, anything that you think might spark their memory, try to bring it. That's one of the things you can also do in the pre-interview. You can say, are there things in your family collection or personal collection that either I can have access to do a better interview, or we can at least have at the interview to help remind you of this event or remind you about your life. Notepad, pen or pencil. I don't think we're at a point now where we can take notes on a laptop while we're conducting an oral history interview. I think it's still a little disconcerting. So what I do is I've just created this one-pager. I think I brought yeah. And this will be one of the, you can do whatever you want. This is just what I've done. There's a section for time. So what elapsed time did I ask the question? What was the question? And then summarize what's being said. Just a few key words. Usually what I write down is either if I'm going to ask a follow-up question, I write down a couple words with a question to remind me I want to ask a follow-up question, or proper nouns. So hopefully I get them spelled correctly. My favorite Wisconsin proper noun spelled correctly is, we used to do a Wisconsin Oral History Day. We did 3 of them when I first got here. The third one we did in Milwaukee. My good friend Todd Moy, who teaches at North Texas and who heads their oral history program, had just written a book about the Tuskegee Airmen of World War II. Do we all have a basic idea of the Tuskegee Airmen? So he worked for the project of the National Park Service that interviewed the Tuskegee Airmen. So he wrote a book about it. It had just come out. Oxford was nice enough to give us some copies for people who signed up for this Wisconsin Oral History Day. So Todd got done with his keynote. We were handing out books, and somebody came up to him, a woman came up to him and said, can you sign your book for me? It's like, sure. She said, wait, don't make it out to me, though. I'm going to donate it to the public library, so make it out to the Oconomowoc Public Library. So Todd's like, how do you spell that? She's like, just like it sounds, which is true. I mean, Oconomowoc, Oconomowoc, I mean, it is. Tooele, Utah, Tooele. Kooski, Idaho, Kooskия. Interviewed a World War II vet who spent all this time talking about Goodenough. Once we got to Goodenough, we were at Goodenough. Once we came back to Goodenough, we stayed in Goodenough for a while, and finally, Goodenough? It's like, yeah, Goodenoughh. The island was Goodenough. Goodenough Island. Like, oh, okay, got it, thank you, moving on. So, notes for proper nouns, notes for follow-ups. Rick, did you have a question? I thought I saw it, no, okay. And you can, if you want, try to get the proper nouns spelled correctly on the record, or you can just wait till after and spell them. Usually what happens if you interview somebody multiple times is you'll ask them to spell something, and then they will start answering you and spelling at the same time, which is always awesome. The other side is, though, a lot of us aren't great spellers, so you always got to take the chance that if you ask them to spell it on the record, they may not appreciate that. So that's why I usually try to wait till afterwards with the spelling of stuff. But the follow-up questions, definitely write those down, because you're not going to remember all the things that they're saying, but your hand will if you write it down quick enough. All right. How am I doing on time? 57 minutes. Sweet. All right, so I'm going back one slide. So after it's done, review the recording. We create a summary. So using this, or if a student didn't conduct the interview, they listen to it, and they create a summary. Summary basically has the elapsed time and what's being said at that time. So 3 minutes in, Troy talks about why he became an oral historian. 6 minutes, 15 seconds, Troy talks about getting the job at UW-Madison. 9 minutes, so on and so forth. So it's not a transcript. It's not a word-for-word rendition of the interview. It's a summary of the interview. We do that because that helps unlock the contents of the interview for people who come and use our collection. We do that because we have interviews in our collection that aren't just 40 minutes long. We have 2 interviews, one with Ira Baldwin, one with Irv Shane, that are both over 40 hours long. Those 2 have been transcribed because back when we first started as a program, we had money to transcribe. But nobody wants to listen to Ira Baldwin for 40 hours. Nobody wants to listen to Irv Shane for 40 hours. Both interesting, fascinating people. So to give someone a summary, particularly in the digital age, you can keyword search that summary and decide how much or how little of this interview you want to listen to. So let's say I say we have 40 hours of Irv Shane, I give you the summary, you do some keyword searching, you say, okay, really I'm only interested in hour 38. So we have saved you 40 hours, plus the fact that nobody would really listen, as I said, to 40 hours. So we're trying to make it more accessible. We do that by creating a summary. Creating a summary also helps you if you want to try to publish this in any way, because then it gives you something that you can look at first before you have to re-listen. This always works well with the students because I try to explain to them, if you create the summary now, you're not going to have to go back and listen to the interview the night before as you're writing the paper. Decide on a follow-up interview. So this project, follow-up interviews may not work, but as I said, I have the luxury of being at a program where we have time to do that. And I strongly recommend that you meet with a person at least 3 times. Once in that pre-interview, 1 recorded, and then a recorded follow-up. Because I can almost guarantee, unless the person is no longer able, which happens, that at the end of that first interview, you still have questions to ask. And I can almost guarantee that if you engaged them, they probably have things they want to say. So I've had follow-up interviews where I haven't had to ask a question. Like I have come back and said, I would like to do a follow-up interview. They will sit down with me. I will turn on the recorder, say who they are, and they will just start. So that's why I always, and again, unless I can just tell that the person is no longer able, I always try to do a follow-up interview. Yes?
When you say no longer able, it makes me wonder if you are interviewing somebody and there's an emotional crisis, how
Right.
you have tools for handling that?
I mean, the only tool that I have to handle that is the tools that I've crafted as a human being. I mean, I'm no sociologist, I'm no social worker, I'm no psychologist, but I have interviewed a ton of people. Colleagues of mine will say, make sure you bring tissues to every interview. That's also why doing the pre-interview is good too, because the hope is that they know from the beginning where you're coming from, and they may push back and say, you know what, I'm not comfortable talking about that. And then it's up to you to decide whether you completely respect their wishes or you say, well, I understand that, but I think historians would chide me if I at least didn't ask the question. So that's a give and take that can happen. And that's, again, why meeting with people in advance and getting to know them might make a situation like that easier. But emotional situations might happen with the most seemingly innocuous question. So I always try to turn the recorder off. I turn the recorder off. If they need water, if they need a tissue. And then once we're back to a point, I ask them if they want to continue. Most of the times they do, because that's not how they want to end. But sometimes they don't. And again, that's why having the luxury of time, I can say, okay, well, let's schedule a follow-up interview then, because I know there are some things I still want to ask, and I assume there's some things you still want to say. That's why interviewing veterans can be a little, could be fraught. So you also, again, want to make sure that if you are interviewing people and you are interviewing them on subjects and topics that might be emotional, that you start to think about that too, like your own self-care, what you need to do as you're hearing this stuff. Publish the interview in some way. So in our case, we try to put all of our interviews, eventually all of our interviews will be online unless the people we interview tell us that they don't want them online. That's how we publish it. We're an archival oral history program, so really what we're trying to do is we're trying to gather oral history that then you all can use for whatever your scholarly or educational purposes are. So that's what we consider publishing. Publishing, though, could be, an article in the Oral History Review, the Journal of the Oral History Association. It could be a blog post. It could be a book. It could be a museum exhibit. It could be a play. It could be a dance. It could be an opera. It could be whatever. I'm contractually obligated, since I work for an archives, to mention that you should have a conversation with an archives about future access to your recordings or material. The Monona Public Library, the Wisconsin Historical Society, the University Archives. My hope is that you do oral history not only for hopefully your own enjoyment and for the person to be able to tell their story, but also so that future generations can hear those stories and be able to utilize or use those stories.
Could you talk to us about after we do the interviews, and maybe you don't get to this, but the whole, considering I type with 2 thumbs and 2 fingers, the transcribing, editing part of this.
So
How is that, or how is that going to be handled?
So I get to say that I have no idea how that's going to be handled, because that's part of that project over there. What I will say, and I don't think you all can wade in if you want right now, but in a perfect world, everything would be transcribed, because there are people that need a transcript, and Our hope is that if people contact us and they are unable to hear the audio that we'll transcribe on demand, it will take us a while because we don't have the resources, but that's how we are dealing with that. But just in general, transcription is tedious, time-consuming, expensive. So while vital, there's a lot of reasons why people and why we end up doing some type of summary that ends up hopefully providing at least an entree into the audio for anyone, even for people who can't hear it. Computers haven't gotten it yet. This is where somebody usually says, well, you know, when I tell Siri, Siri, play Duran Duran, and Siri says, playing a fan. Computers are really good at one person's voice, clearly enunciated with that classic Midwestern accent. Computers do not like oral history because it's messy. We talk over each other. Sometimes we talk soft. Sometimes we talk loud. And computers haven't quite figured out proper nouns yet. The Historical Society, my colleague and Rick's colleague, Paul Hedges, sent some stuff through. It's been a couple years now. The computers are getting better. But he sent some stuff through from interviews that were done in Milwaukee in the 60s. And for some reason, the computers seemed to think that Snoop Dogg existed in the 1950s because Snoop Dogg appeared a lot in the transcript. So the computer just heard, and the computer used current lingo and heard Snoop Dogg, and so the computer put Snoop Dogg in the transcript.
What was it?
I forgot to ask Paul what it was. I have an example of one that I did, but I forgot to bring it. Yes?
So I'll say, regarding transcriptions, our hope is that every interview will be transcribed at some point. Now, if we end up with like 1 million interviews, we'll get there eventually. If you look on your slips of paper that we are asking you to fill out, one of the ways you can volunteer is by transcribing.
Ooh.
That's what made me ask the question.
Yeah, and so we hope we'll have you and some other volunteers that will be willing to help in that very valuable service to this. As Troy mentioned, I have done transcribing myself. I will be honest, it is not the most fun part, but it's very valuable.
Mm-hmm.
It really helps for those instances where maybe if you have no issues with hearing, but still you can't quite determine what they're saying, you can go into transcription. For those people that are hard of hearing or can't hear, it's invaluable.
Yep.
So we will be trying to get those.
And the great thing about a project like this, and the great thing that you've added or had in this project is you don't have to be the interviewer to contribute to this project. You know, you can be the transcription person, or you can listen to it to do summaries or whatever. Because oral history is not just the interviewing. It's all the stuff that goes around it too. We want to be out of here by 7:45, right?
Ideally.
Okay. Yes, somebody had a question.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm a student out of state. I was I was raised in Monona and have been here for many years, but I'm going to school in California. And so is it possible for for me to be a transcriber just remotely? How do you feel that works?
I think the answer to that is yes. Tony nodding head yes for the. But really how it works is you download software like Express Scribe is some free software. You'd have to learn the hotkeys probably because the foot pedal, you can get a foot pedal that'll start it and stop it for you, but the hotkeys will allow you to start and stop it. And then all they'll have to do is upload the audio to the cloud.
Okay.
And that's how I would do it. And if you ever want to volunteer for the UW-Madison Archives, don't hesitate to. Were there other questions before we? Okay. So I always like to finish with a clip. So we've talked a lot about the transcript. I still feel again that if you physically have a choice, if you're physically able to either listen or read, that we should listen. Most of you might probably do agree with me, but I want to give you an example of why that is. This is Gertrude Maxwell. This is from the Idaho Oral History Center. Hunting season is now past, but this is a story about Gertrude Maxwell who, back in the 20s and 30s, led elk hunting guides throughout northern Idaho, what we call in Idaho the Panhandle, so the area of Idaho closest to Canada. This is one particular elk hunting trip.
The boys hadn't been having very much luck, and I'd been going with one man whom I was supposed to guide, and the others didn't want to guide, because the guide at that time cost about $25 a day, and the others wanted to hunt on their own. And they were very poor hunters, and they didn't know the terrain. So one morning I said to the man I was guiding, "Why don't you rest today and cure up the blisters on your feet? And I'll go with these fellows and get them a shot." He said, "Well, I believe that'll just be fine with me. I'm awful tired." He said, "You just drag me through this brush until I'm all in." And I took, I think, 5. The other 5, I said, "I know where I can place you on a stand, and if you'll do what I tell you, you'll get a shot. And if you don't do what I tell you, you won't get anything, but it'll be the same as getting an elk as far as I'm concerned. If I show you elk and you miss them." So we tramped about 3 or 4 hours, and I put them on a real stand where they could see the mountains. And a big basin. I said, "I'm going through that basin. Don't you shoot at me either. I'm going through the basin, and if there's any elk in there, they'll run up this trail and cross the ridge." I pointed at an old snag. I said, "They'll cross about there if there's any in here." And they were real agreeable, and oh my, I said, "There's only one thing. You must promise me that you'll not move till I return, because you can get lost in here, and this is a long ways back, and it'd sure camoodle my plans and yours too." And though they would do everything, now I said, "They'll come up this trail if there's any here, because I won't shoot at them where I am. All I'm doing is flushing them by you." And oh, they were just delighted. They had seen elk, but they'd been too slow. So it took me 2 hours to go down and through the basin. And I spooked the elk. Oh, there were a lot of them in there. And I spooked them out. I beat the brush and spooked them out. And I could hear. And then I was tired, and I sat down to listen for the shooting, because they went exactly where I said they would. And I didn't hear any shooting. And I thought, well, that's funny, because I know they went exactly where I said. I know they had plenty of time for a shot as they went up this grade and crossed the ridge. So after another 2 hours, I worked my way back, and there's one thing those fellows did that was right. They stayed where they were. I found them sitting right exactly where I'd left them. And they said, I said to them, "My goodness, why didn't you shoot? Didn't you see them?" "Oh, yes, there's 15 head. "Oh, well," I said, "weren't there any bulls in it?" "Oh, yeah, there's 5 or 6 good bulls." Well, I said, "My goodness, why didn't you shoot? It wasn't too long a shot, maybe 200 yards. They said, "You know, Gertrude, they didn't stop."
Hunting would be so easy, wouldn't it? So this is usually to the students that I talk about. So, does anybody really care? So it's from a Chicago song. Does anybody really know what time it is? Does anybody really care? Why? Why am I up here? Why are you all possibly going to volunteer to be a part of this? Why does it matter? Well, it matters to the folks at the public library because they have made it a priority to try to gather stories about their city. It should matter to you because if you do this right, you help to create a primary document. A lot of my fellow librarians and archivists are a little bit jealous about what I do because I actually get to create primary sources. And it's going to matter to posterity. I didn't interview Ellen Tarko, but I got an email from her granddaughter in 2012, Shoshana. And Shoshana said, "I see you have an interview with my grandmother. I know you have an interview with my grandfather. I only have the transcript. Can you send me the audio?" So 2012, the cloud existed then. Clouds have existed for a long time. The cloud existed then. So I put the interview up in the cloud and got this email back saying, "Thank you so much. I hadn't heard my grandmother's voice in quite some time. So what you do may matter to somebody down the road who you don't even know why it would matter to them. 1945, I'm pretty sure the humans are being interviewed and not the lambs. I have a joke about this, but my wife says I can't tell it because it's too bad. Or am I just too bashful? Or there's a game on Friday, so go Badgers. No? All right. I always like to end with a really bad joke. Thank you. Thank you for playing along. This was Oral History 101.